Crispy, crackling, juicy roast pork and apple sauce. There's not much better than this winter classic, so let's get stuck in. The roast pork. When you're buying pork, you want to look for something with a good layer of fat on the top. I got this pork from the butcher and he'd already scored it. I'm gonna go over those score lines again just to make sure that they're all right, and then I'm gonna re-tie it. So using a sharp knife, pull through the skin to make sure you're scoring down through the skin into the fat layer. Once you've done that, you're gonna tie it up using butcher's twine. The reason we tie it up is that we get a nicer shape and it should cook more evenly. Once we've tied it up about 5 or 6 times, depending on the size of the piece of pork, we're gonna season this really, really heavily with salt. Then we're gonna chuck it in the fridge on a wire rack and leave it overnight. Now what this does is it draws the moisture out from the skin, which is gonna help us give us really, really nice crackling. So now that was all yesterday. This is today, the next day, and you can see it's still got salt on the top. What we need to do is to get rid of all that salt. So we're just gonna brush it off and then we're gonna dry it really well with a paper towel. So you can even use a pastry brush. You wanna get a lot of that salt off. You're not gonna get off the stuff that's in the score lines, but we'll get as much as we can off it. All right, let's get some paper towel. So now we're just gonna dry this as well as we can, and that's gonna really help the crackling. Now I'm gonna use this tray underneath to roast this, but I am gonna give it a rinse to get rid of all the salt. You can just use that rack to cook it on, but I've got this fennel that we're gonna roast, and you're gonna have to take these top bits off anyway. So we're gonna use that to prop up our pork, and it should fragrance the pork just a little bit too with that really lovely fennelly aniseedy flavor. Before we do that, we want to season the underside of it. So just get a little bit of oil on there. And that oil is just literally acting as a binder. Season the underside and the side before we put it on our fennel. All right, one last dry, just to make sure we've got as much of that moisture off there as possible. For another little drizzle of oil on the skin. This just helps the crackling action to start. We use that same brush just to make sure it's nice and even. And then we're gonna put a little bit more salt on the top because we pushed most of that salt off. But once we've put that new layer of salt, we wanna get it in the oven pretty quickly. So the oven is set to 230 degrees Celsius, and we're gonna shove that in there for 30 minutes at that temperature before we turn it down to 180 to finish cooking. So let's get the salt on here, just a little bit, another sprinkle on the top, and get it in the oven. Hey Siri, set a timer for 30 minutes.
30 minutes, starting now.
All right, it wouldn't be roast pork without apple sauce. Well, sometimes it can be called apple butter as well. I keep it pretty simple. I use Granny Smith apples and I dice them up pretty small. Not super small, but I don't know about that size, 2 centimeter cube pieces. Doesn't really matter anyway because they're gonna get pureed. And then we're gonna put them into a pot. To that, we're gonna add caster sugar, apple cider vinegar, star anise, and cinnamon. And as the name suggests, butter. Let's get that on the heat. So that's on a medium heat, and it's probably gonna take a good hour and a half, or hour to hour and a half to get right down in the right color that we're looking for. But let's get stuck into the next thing, which is the braised red cabbage. For the cabbage, you're gonna need a pot that you got the lid for, and you'll be surprised at how much this half a head of red cabbage uses, how much space it uses, I should say. So pretty simply, you're gonna take the core out, and then chop it in half. And then we're gonna do what we call chiffonade. So chiffonade is where you cut things quite finely. And you just wanna make sure it's all relatively the same size so it cooks evenly. Red cabbage is like a real classic complement to pork. It's always usually red, I think, because it just has like a nicer flavor, kind of complements it better. So our cabbage is now cut and we've got a pot with a lid. So in the cabbage goes. And then very similar to the apple butter, we're just gonna put some butter in there, some star anise, some cinnamon. We're gonna use a little bit of apple cider vinegar as well, but I like maple syrup in this one. I just like the flavor, kind of works really well. Of course, salt and pepper. Lid on the heat. And then while we're back here, we've got some spuds going on to mash. You want a mashing potato, same as a chipping potato, not a waxy potato. Lots of water, and then a good amount of salt. High heat, and you want to boil those until they're fork tender. All right, so we can see the apples are starting to break down, but at this point, all the liquid's kind of evaporated. So we just need to keep an eye on it. Make sure you're stirring it every 5 to 10 minutes, or even less, even kind of 4 to 5 minutes. But we are looking for like quite a darkish color, almost the same color as the cinnamon stick. So it's just gonna develop over time. And if it does start to catch, don't be afraid just to put a dash of water in there, just so it doesn't, get too kind of crazy on the bottom. Cabbage has been going for a few minutes now. And the reason we have this lid on this is because we're trying to use the steam to really cook this cabbage and get it nice and tender. Likewise with the apple, just make sure that you don't completely dry this out. As soon as this dries out, it could catch because there's quite a bit of sugar in here. Let's let those do their thing and we'll get on to the fennel. All right, roast fennel. It's absolutely one of my favorite veggies to roast, and it's really easy. You can see the anatomy of this bowl. It's clearly got a big root at the bottom. That's what we're gonna use to keep this all together. Now we're just gonna literally cut these bulbs into quarters, nice and big. The biggest, flattest surface we're gonna put facing down on a lined baking sheet. You don't need to line it just makes cleaning up a lot easier. Once all these are cut and on here, we're gonna give them a good drizzle of olive oil, season them with salt, and then we're gonna get them in the oven with the pork. So before we put this in, we're just gonna check this pork because it has been half an hour. She is looking stunning. Woo. So our fennel goes in underneath it. Shut the door. So we're going to turn that down to 180, and then we're going to cook this pork to an internal temperature of 150 Fahrenheit or like 65 degrees Celsius. At that point, we're going to remove it and rest it, and it will continue cooking another 3 or 4 degrees. Pork's generally safe these days for a big piece of loin like that at about 65 degrees Celsius. However, it will be slightly pink still, which kind of freaks some people out. So I like to pull it out at 65. It'll continue cooking another 3 to 4 degrees, and then you have like a beautifully just cooked piece of pork that's still nice and juicy. All right, our apple sauce has got really good color, and it looks like it's pretty much cooked out now, just because we didn't peel them with the skins on there. We need to make sure they're nice and soft. And our potatoes are cooked all the way through, which is perfect. So we'll get those drained off, put them back in the pot, and you don't need to turn the heat back on, but the residual heat from that pot just steams those potatoes and gets any other liquid or moisture left on them before we put them through the masher or the moulie. So that's up next. All right, I get a lot of questions about this in my short form content. That's a loud noise. This is what we call a moulie in the industry. My mum used to use these for making baby food back before blenders were a thing. Basically, it's a spiral and it pushes it through some holes. There's different sizes of these. The other thing you could use is a ricer. These are pretty common, or just a plain old masher works just as well. But today I'm gonna use the moulie. So this works pretty simply. This is our pot that we cooked our potatoes in, moulie in there. Potatoes go in, and there's a trick to these is not to overfill them, or it starts flying out. Crank the handle, and then it comes on out all nice and smooth. So to that big knob of butter, the heat of those potatoes will melt them, and a dash of milk. Now we're making potato mash here, not pommes puree, so we don't want it too runny. Once we've got the consistency we want, we'll then add the mustard. So what I like to do is just work that butter in there, and then just leave it just to let it melt before we incorporate the rest of the way. All right, that butter should have pretty much melted. And you can see, using that moulie, we get really silky mash without heaps of effort. We haven't passed this through a drum sieve. We're not in the restaurant. I have no intention of passing this through a drum sieve. This is as smooth as I want my mash at home. All right, we're gonna have a taste. Needs a little bit of salt, and obviously the mustard. So then I like to use seeded mustard, a good heaped tablespoon. Actually, we're gonna go 2 heaped tablespoons. And then we're simply gonna fold that through. Back over on the stove on a low heat, just to keep it warm until we need it. All right, our apple sauce is looking good, nice and cooked. We're just gonna puree this with the stick blender, pretty simply. Blend it up. And then I like to add another couple of little pieces of butter at the end. Just makes it all nice and velvety and shiny. And there's our apple butter done. Yum. All right, the fennel's out of the oven, and we're just gonna check to see if it's cooked. Yeah, you can pierce it through, so it's nicely cooked, but it's still holding together. Gonna let those chill out for a second, and then we'll flash them again once we need it for serving. All right, pork's looking good. Just check this temperature. We are there, bang on. So I'm just gonna lift this off and put it on a rack to rest so that the bottom doesn't kind of continue cooking, and we'll let that skin dry out a little bit more. We really want this to rest for, at least kind of 15 minutes. It's gonna hold its temperature inside the middle anyway, so don't worry about it kind of cooling down. So we'll let that just chill for a while, and we'll come back. So this has been out of the oven for 15 minutes now, and we're gonna go the extra mile. You can see it's pretty crispy, but we can do a little bit better, I think. So this was in the oven at 180 for an hour. So it was in there for half an hour at the 240. Then we turned it down. It was just over an hour, about an hour and 5. Now use that as a guide, but please make sure you're probing your meat. Make sure you don't going off time and you go off temperature. Super important. So all we're gonna do is unstring this, So I've got the oven on grill, on like 100% power on grill. We're gonna pop this back in there and get the skin puffed up even more. You gotta watch this like a hawk. You can even do it with the door open a little bit if you need to. You cannot leave it, you need to watch it the whole time because it'll catch and burn pretty quickly. Now with this, depending on the fat levels and the dryness of your skin, this could take 2 minutes or it could take 10 minutes. So that's why it's super important just to keep your eye on it. Because once it starts to go, it'll go quick. Beautiful. There we go, looking good. So all that did was just puff that real top layer of skin up just a little bit more and just got a little bit drier. Now it's already mainly rested and it's pretty hot already in the center. So we'll just let that chill out for a second. We'll get all the other garnishes ready and we'll plate up a dish. All right, it's time to carve this. And a trick with good crackling is use a bread knife to carve it. It's good to like go through the crackle. If you want to be fancy, then you can change to a cook's knife to get through the muscle itself. Let's see how I did. Oh. Still nice and juicy, crispy top. How good. Let's get the rest of this carved and then we'll get it plated up. So there we go, our crispy roast pork, mustard mash, braised red cabbage, fennel, and apple butter. It's fair to say, we'll probably cook this one a few times this season. Yum. That sweet apple butter goes so well with that crispy, salty pork crackling. Thanks for watching, legends. Like if you took anything from this video, subscribe if you're not, and we'll see you next Sunday for another recipe. Peace. Come on, you lot, come and eat.